Good morning to all of you. It is rather hard for me to believe that 32 years ago, I attended my very first Art Chicago fair here on the Navy Pier. As proof of that, I brought my 1980 Art Chicago catalog, and I feel very old right now. It would have even been harder for me to believe then that I'd be sitting here in front of you this morning for Art Expo 2012, the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art and Design, who is hosting us and whom we thank for the opportunity. And never could I have imagined that this morning I would be having the privilege to interview our guest. Together we will be exploring a career that is unique for its remarkable variety. It starts with collage and installation and then moves swiftly and forcefully through a kaleidoscope of styles and mediums, including painting, video, architectural structures, and sculpture in formica, urethane, acrylic, ceramic, fabric, aluminum, steel, and bronze. Since his first public exhibition one short decade ago, he has had over 30 one-person exhibitions and been included in over 130 group exhibitions in 16 countries. His work is in the collections as diverse as the Tate Modern in London, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Honart Museum in Tehran, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, the Modern Museum for Modern Kunst in Oslo, MoCA and LACMA in Los Angeles, MoMA and the Guggenheim in New York, and perhaps most importantly of all, the AIC and Museum of Contemporary Art here in Chicago. Upcoming exhibitions include the Bonniers Konsthall in Stockholm, the Macro Museum in Rome, and Museum d'Anthens in Belgium. Roberta Smith, senior art critic of the New York Times, called him one of the most interesting artists to emerge in this century, and I am very proud this morning to welcome Sterling Ruby.
I'm going to pull this chair over a little bit.
Oh, you want to drag
so I
the
can be a little closer to Todd.
Oh, you
Thank
brought
you.
notes.
Yes.
Okay.
I
All right. Well, let's see.
Maybe I should. I'm going to pull it back again because I feel weird being under the screen.
It's okay. There's plenty of room there.
Thank you.
Well, as we retrace the steps that shape the art and the artist, we'll begin our discussion at the beginning. Where did your journey begin? Where and when were you born?
I was born in Bitburg, Germany. It's an extremely small town in Germany, kind of east of Cologne, and it's an Air Force base, really. There's three things in Bitburg. There's the Air Force base. There's a very, very, very big monastery, which is where I was born, under the guise of all these nuns. And then there's the Bitburg beer factory. So between those three things, it's a unique place. Yeah.
And what is the name on your birth certificate?
Middle included?
In
Yeah,
everything.
yeah. Sterling Pete Ruby.
And your father's name is also?
My father's name is Harry, actually. I'm sure he didn't tell you that. But,
I didn't ask.
Yeah. His middle name is Sterling, and I think that he never liked Harry. Really, really despised Harry, and so I think maybe what I've been told is further into my early years, he decided to opt for that name as well. Yeah.
And your mother's name?
My mother's maiden name was Pietenau van de Putten. She's Dutch. She was Dutch, yeah.
And your father's lineage is American, though?
He is. He's
Okay.
Was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland.
So around the time you were born in Bitburg, your father was serving in the United States Air Force. And carried a rather impressive title. I'm going to read this because it is long. He was the Munitions Maintenance Technician Crew Chief with top secret security clearance in nuclear weapons, missile systems, and explosive disposal. Please tell us what your mother did.
You know, it's funny because I never knew that about my father. This is all relatively new. I don't know where Todd. Anyway, but I mean, my father worked in the Air Force, and you know.
And your mom, did she work, or?
My mother. When we moved to the States, my mother ran a bicycle shop.
Okay.
And you know, I mean, prior to that, I homemaker. Yeah.
And the Dutch do a great deal of bicycling in Amsterdam, so that's not something that would be unusual by any stretch
Absolutely
of the imagination.
Not. It was totally embedded into her DNA. Yeah. So.
Before your family migrated to the United States, did you bump around Europe at all from Bitburg, or?
Yeah, we lived for a number of years in Germany, in Bitburg, and then we moved to Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And then by the time I was 5, we moved back to Baltimore.
Okay, so in Baltimore, you were in a highly urban environment. Do you have early memories of your time in Baltimore at all, or not really?
I do, yeah. I mean, this was even, you know, kind of happening when we lived in Europe. My parents always lived with a number of families, both in Germany and in the Netherlands, and then even when we lived in Baltimore. And so it was a relatively big house. We had a yard, but I specifically remember the school. It was a heavy inner city school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, at a certain point, you moved again, the family moved again, but this time to a rural Pennsylvania farm community, a rather agricultural, bucolic setting, quite the opposite of where you had been. And a common thread that I've encountered in giving discussions like this many times is the shaping effect of hard times in childhood. Farming did not provide enough income for the family, so your father applied his expertise from the Air Force and went into civilian engineering, where he was involved in the controlled demolition of abandoned buildings and bridges and warehouses. How did the move from Baltimore to Philadelphia affect you, and do you recall those times in any way as being a bit of a challenge for the family, or not really?
I do. I mean, this was around 8 to 10, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was totally conscious of what was happening. And my parents had become obsessed with Mother Earth News, which was a publication throughout the...
Like Mother Jones?
I think it is like Mother Jones, but
Okay.
there was like a whole other publication that was like a subscription.
Hmm.
And it was called Mother Earth News. And it was, you know, it was primarily geared towards, you know, the post-hippie movement that was more agricultural. And so my parents, they had this concept that they were going to drop everything and become farmers.
Okay.
And so I specifically remember as a kid looking at farmhouses, and each one was worse than the next. But, you know, for them it was more about finding a place that was economically viable for them at the time, and then also something that had a lot of land. So we moved into this farmhouse that was a complete ramshackle. It took them 10 years to really get it up to par, and we had a cast iron stove that was predominantly throughout my early teenage years was our main, you know, source of heat. Not that, you know, I'm not romanticizing that, but it is, you know, reflective in terms of things that I specifically remember. At the same time, we moved to this farmhouse, and we had a lot of land, and you know, they continued the kind of trajectory of what they had done years before, both in Europe and in Baltimore. We wound up at some point having a lot of people live with us. Yeah.
Around this time, 8, 10, I don't know exactly, in terms of what your father was doing to earn money, the civilian engineering job, I believe that occasionally you were given the honor of pushing the big red button to bring down the occasional bridge or building.
Yeah, I mean, my father worked for this company called Explosive Engineers out of Baltimore, and he would commute every day. And I remember the logo. It was like, you know, he would wear these shirts that had this kind of circular icon on it with Explosive Engineers and then this huge lightning bolt through it. And, you know, but I think like most kids, you don't necessarily know what your parents do until you go to work with them. And I mean, my father over those years started taking me to like the explosions. You know, they would pack dynamite for weeks. And then, you know, when it would come time to like taking something down, I would get to go. And yeah, that was the first, I do remember the first time he blew up a chimney, a really big factory chimney. And it was this scenario where, again, he would work for weeks, and then I came in with him, and it was like the first time that I actually realized what he did for a profession. And we got underneath the trucks. I mean, the entire crew would like, you know, the whole thing is that you have to get underneath of the trucks and the vehicles. And then there was just this little red button. Yeah. And so
a lot of power in that phone.
No, it was totally like, you know, shooting your first firearm, perhaps. Yeah, that was seminal.
Okay. During, at least up to this point in your childhood, was there an awareness of visual art? Were you ever taken to museums or galleries?
Yes and no. My parents, and you know, particularly my family in the States. It was a very small family in the States. In the Netherlands, it was a much bigger family, but in the States, I had a grandfather, a grandmother, and an aunt. No culture whatsoever in the States. We would go back to visit family in the Netherlands. My mother and I would go back every year and a half to 2 years. And I do remember, I don't necessarily know if it was intentional on her part to like culture me, but I do remember, you know, because we were in the middle of Flemish country, she would take me every once in a while on these trips, and we would see, you know, I don't necessarily know if she just envisioned what boy, you know, a young boy would like, but she would take me to see the Hieronymus Bosch paintings a good bit. Yeah.
Now, when you were about, I think, around 12 years old, you discovered the first art form that did have a meaningful effect on you, which we've talked about, but rather than visual, it was musical, and that was punk rock. One of the most important punk labels, which is Touch and Go Records, was started near me in the Detroit area when I was younger by two guys named Dave Stimson and Tesco V, and they represented a number of bands that were favorites of mine, at least of the time. The Butthole Surfers, Meatmen, Necros, The Fix, Negative Approach, and a couple of bands which we'll mention in a moment, particularly Killdozer and Big Black. Yeah. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The mid-1980s period in punk rock music was referred to as Revolution Summer. And local bands in the area where you were discovering this in Washington, Ian MacKaye particularly, who was the leader of a group called Minor Threat, and then that became Embrace, and then that became a band very well known called Fugazi, as well as others, 9353 and Government Issue, were regular performers and recorded for Discord Music. And at the time, they were playing at a club that you began to frequent, which was the 930 Club in Washington, D.C. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about the 930 Club.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think that this seems more frequent than maybe people think, but visually, there was something aesthetically pleasing for me that was related to not only music or punk music, but also skateboarding. I think right around the age of 11, I started to skate, and there were all of these kind of connections to that, you know, aesthetic connections, music connections. It was basically, it was a cultural movement in and of itself, and it was very secluded. It wasn't, skateboarding wasn't what it is now. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar business that, you know, succumbed everybody from the age of 6 to 50. It was relatively on the cuff, and anyway, I think a lot of my early influence was more along the lines of like 80s punk, MDC, Black Flag, which over the years, you know, transformed my interest not only from that, but also to, you know, what Todd is talking about in regards to the Chicago scene, Big Black, but also at other New York scenes, LA scenes like the Swans. I don't know. I mean, I had a lot of friends who were much older, and I couldn't even drive at that point. I think by the age of 12, 13, you know, looking back on it now, especially with children of my own, it's I'm kind of shocked that they allowed me to do this. But you know, in 9th grade and throughout high school, we would go to DC three times a week to see shows. And you know, DC wasn't necessarily close. We lived right on the Mason-Dixon border of Pennsylvania and Maryland, and so it was still an hour and a half away. And the shows would last, you know, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. But I remember my mother always saying, like, as long as you got up in time to go to school, you could do whatever you want.
That is not what my mother said to me.
Yeah, no, I know. Which I thought was, you know, I mean, at that time, I was like, fuck it. But, you know, I mean, it was very liberating, I'm sure. The 930 was a club that every single touring band played at. And so, you know, one of the biggest accesses to that was the fact that on a weekly basis, you could easily see, you could see 7 shows. You know, every you know, you could see 7 shows in 7 nights, but we typically would see 3 shows a week, and everybody played. But you know, again, at that time, all of these bands were touring in you know, a conversion van. You know, there was 6 people in a van at a time. You know, there was absolutely no money, and so it was very DIY, which I appreciated and found even more punk. You know.
And just as an aside, I mean, because you touched on it, so my research tells me that you were one of the 1992 Acme skateboard video specialists, as well. You skated for Planet Earth, because you had talked about, and skateboarding and punk are linked in some subcultural way. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Throughout my teenage years, up until 18, I was a pro skateboarder, and I toured a lot. So it was.
I saw the video.
I think that being able to, you know, go to DC 3 times a week was really. It was a kind of transient sensation. It was, you know, being able to get away from, you know, guidance. You know, being able to get away from parental guidance, and all throughout high school, that was kind of. We would tour throughout every summer, and so every summer I was in a van with a bunch of guys.
So in the midst of all this, where did you go to high school?
I went to a predominantly agriculture high school in Fawn Grove, Pennsylvania. The name of it was Kennerdale High School. Yeah.
And did they have an art program? I'm just curious, or were you involved in that, or?
They did not have an art program. They had 2 art classes. I guess there were art classes. They had drafting, which I took, and that was predominantly tool drafting. So it was like drafting for people who wanted to be production designers for tool manufacturers.
So the classic sliding horizontal with a 30-60-90 and a 45-45-90 triangle, and you would draw.
Yeah, and we learned to, you know, when you do a line, you have to spin the pencil and things like
Absolutely.
that. Yeah. And then we had a calligraphy class, which was predominantly for women, or for young women. And I say that because I took the calligraphy class as well, and you know, because it was visual, and I thought, this is great. I could make my own zine. You know,
Wait, visual in terms of the calligraphy, or visual in terms of the women?
No.
Oh, okay.
Visually in terms of the calligraphy.
Oh, okay.
But you know, and I kept taking this class every year, and the teacher was actually quite, you know, nice. But I was the only male in the class, and I realized right off the bat that the reason why they did calligraphy is for wedding invitations.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Do you still do? Do you still do that today for friends, or?
Well, I've tried.
Okay.
I lost it in translation.
After graduating in 1990, I believe,
89.
you did not go directly onto college.
Yeah.
Many art students have vivid accounts of the aptly named odd jobs that they performed during the time that they had to endure pursuing their schooling and chosen careers. You worked construction. And for how long, and what did you do in general terms?
I was a shoveler.
Okay.
I was like a manual labor kind of guy. I did not do well in high school. And I graduated. I mean, this was not a big high school, of course. I think that maybe my graduating class was, I don't know how many there were, but I was third from the very bottom. I almost I almost had to get my GED. And so, you know, not that that was a very big scenario for that particular high school. Most students didn't go to college. Most of them kind of fell into family businesses, which were predominantly farming. You know, I didn't have any skills, and it was. I needed a job, and I still, at that point, really enjoyed DC and going to DC, and so I got a job. I got a government job, which was a union job, because of my father. My father had some friends who were working as contractors on this kind of big government demo and road work and dirt work job, and he got me, you know, I mean, he got one of his friends to hire me, which was a total fiasco, you know, because I show up and I'm this size, and you know everybody else is a different size, and I'm also, you know, I don't have any experience, but I was always pretty good at woodworking, at you know, my father would give me a lot of chores around the farm, and so you know I could do it. It wasn't a big deal. I did that for a number of years.
Was this a useful experience to you later in your art career, either from a technical perspective of knowing how to build things, or in your case, sometimes destroy them, or from an aesthetic point of view?
No, not really.
Okay.
I mean, it was and it wasn't. I mean, I think very early on, with, you know, starting to skate, all of my friends became woodworkers. You know, we kind of learned a lot of tool skills based on building things, building ramps, that I do think were catalysts for being able to just like set up a very big shop and learn how to do things. I feel like I have pretty good mechanical skills. But working construction was different. You know, that was you know, manual labor for 8 to 12 hours a day, depending on what the shift was. And I think it was just a burden on the body more than anything.
And the mind as well,
yeah,
during
and
that
a lot
time.
of the people that I worked with, you know, were, I think at that point, probably 30, and they looked like they were 60, you know, and that became very evident.
During this same time frame, you also formed a band.
Yeah.
And there you are. In listening to your music, I would say that it was certainly not metal in the strict sense. It's not industrial in the strict sense, and it's certainly not punk in the strict sense, though it draws on all those genres and attitudes in its own way. In general terms, listening to it, it did sound to me to fit within the world that we were talking about, groups such as Killdozer and Big Black, and I was wondering simply what you could share with us about the band and what your involvement was.
This was these are very close friends that I lived with. This is a guy named Swag. This is Jennifer. But it went through different. The band went through different transformations. Sometimes we had 6 members. Sometimes we had 3 members. It was a process of failure for a long time. I played drums. I played guitar. I did some singing. We did programming. Drum program. I mean, it ran the kind of gamut. But I think in terms of relating it to Chicago, one of my favorite and most influential bands of all time, maybe not so much anymore, but at the time was Big Black. And so Steve Albini, this kind of producer engineer here in Chicago, became a kind of big icon. We wanted to make aggressive music, and we kind of made it into a hybrid of a lot of different things, not only metal but blues, and it was scrappy. It was totally scrappy. But we got so far that we toured a good bit, and before we broke up, we did an album with Steve Albini. So we spent a lot of time in Chicago, recording with Albini and getting to be friends with a lot of those guys. But like pretty much most everybody at the time, we fell to the fact that we were getting. I mean, we weren't getting old per se, but we needed jobs. We had no money, and it was too much. And we were offered a couple of record deals, and it after really, we weren't stupid. But we did also know by signing these record deals, we'd just become indebted to somebody, to a corporation, for the rest of our lives. And so we just we didn't do it. And a couple of years later, we broke up.
So having covered a chunk of sort of your biographical background, yeah. Let's move on and begin to discuss how and when and where you found your actual vocation. You did eventually, after time, embark on undergraduate classes at the Pennsylvania School of Art, now the Pennsylvania College of Art and Design in Lancaster. You learned visual basics there, like perspective and composition, and formal basics like still life and figure drawing. What do you want to tell us about your undergraduate years?
Yeah, it didn't look like this at all. This is
the Prince Street.
A present facade.
Exactly.
I believe. I was working construction, and I was super depressed, and I felt like I screwed up. I really felt like I didn't have anything to fall back on, and my grade average in high school was so bad that I couldn't, not that that's a big deal, but it was like, there was no college that would take me. And so my mother knew a guy, he was a wildlife illustrator who worked here. And, she was like, listen, my son loves to draw. He really needs a change in his life. Can you help him out? And, I went in and I did a, portfolio presentation. And we had a cat that I drew all the time. And, I presented this and they were like, whoa, this is not too good. But sure, yeah, well, we're going to let you in. And it was great. I got in, but it was a foundation school. And I don't necessarily know if everybody knows what that means, but most art schools now are not like this. It was a really traditional school. We did painting, drawing, and sculpture. And it was a non-accredited college, which means that it didn't have a degree, but it was a 4-year college. So it was you had to do it as if there was a degree at the end, but you didn't get it, which would become a reoccurring theme for me. We would draw the nude figure for like 8 hours a day. We would draw bowls of fruit. We would do perspectives in rooms. There were a lot of things that I really enjoyed, but later on I realized that this wasn't the same art education that a lot of artists my age go through. In terms of a kind of conceptual practice, I don't think artists do it anymore, I know that there are larger universities like the Art Institute, which has a kind of 1-year foundation program, and then you kind of vary and get into more specifics in regard to contemporary practice. But this school was very much embedded into figuration, perspective, and in the later years, abstract expressionism.
Okay. Now, you did eventually graduate, non-degreed, but there was a graduation, and you then moved on to Chicago at around 28, around the year 2000.
Yeah.
And what was your initial experience then when you came to Chicago and began school at the AIC? This had to be a very different kind of dynamic for you.
Yeah, it was, my first year at the Art Institute was super hard. The last year that I was in Pennsylvania, I saw Bruce Naumann's retrospective at MoMA in New York. And it really hammered it home that I had spent 4 years doing something that wasn't necessarily what, looking back on it, it made a lot of sense. But at that time, after I saw Naumann's retrospective, it didn't make any sense. It was like, shit, this isn't what, I'm not going to be drawing the figure for the rest of my life. I want to do this. This is exciting. And I think I felt at that time that I had kind of cheated myself out of a number of years. But so there was that, and then there was also, I'll just talk about like these kind of catalysts that were happening in Pennsylvania that last year. One of the reasons why the school didn't have an accreditation was that the library wasn't big enough. They didn't have enough volumes in their library. And most of their library was typically, what you would see in a school like that. A ton of Picasso periodicals, de Kooning, Rothko, Pollock. But they had this really crazy red herring catalog, and I don't know who got it, but I took it out kind of nonstop that last year, and it was the Helter Skelter catalog, the Paul Schimmel show that he did at MoCA in LA. And I realized that there was something else out there that nobody was talking about in that particular program, but I also didn't, my family, nobody in my family had ever gone to college, and so I didn't know the trajectory or how to get to it, and so when I moved to Chicago and started at the Art Institute, I realized that I was really behind. I was stuck in this class with, or a number of classes which were catch-up classes, art history classes, theory classes, no studio classes. There really wasn't any studio classes. Mostly theory and psych classes. A lot of psychology and a lot of philosophy courses.
Two things, at least on the early end, when you moved to Chicago, seemed to have a profound impact on you. One was, well, you mentioned the Naumann exhibition that you had seen at MoMA, which I remember was curated by Rob Storr, and in the project room there was Tom Friedman at the same time. So one of the things that had a big effect was your discovery in the permanent collection at the Art Institute here in Chicago is Bruce Naumann's sculpture, Learned Helplessness and Rats Rock and Roll Drummer. The other thing was the time that you spent working in, and I believe researching at, the Video Data Bank.
Yeah. I've thought about Naumann's. I've always thought about Naumann's piece from that Learned Helplessness and Rats piece from the first time that I saw it. But I've thought about it so much over the years that I think I understand it. But at the time when I first saw it, it was just aura. It had something. I didn't necessarily know what the ideas were behind it, but it had something. And one of the things is it didn't have necessarily a goal, but it had a drive. And it was a case study, so it was completely psychological, but it had no endpoint. So it was just like this Nietzschean synopsis of chasing, which felt super schizophrenic, and again, made me realize that that's the kind of work that I'm not only attracted to, but that I wanted to make. The other thing that happened in Chicago is that, again, I needed a job. I had some loans, but I needed a job, and so I applied for this secretarial job at the Video Data Bank at the Art Institute. And the Video Data Bank, for those of you who don't know it, is one of the two biggest video art artist interviews and performance libraries in the world. It was started in 1968 by Kate Horsfield and her partner at the time, Lynn Blumenfeld. And it holds everything. I didn't know anything. I just applied for a job to be their phone person. And I worked there, I think I worked there the whole time that I was in Chicago, right? Yeah. I mean, so it wound up, over time, I got taken out of the desk, in the front desk, and I got put into the editing bays and into the, the dubbing room and into the, the actual storage, which was really nice, because that was like the contemporary education. I mean, at that point, what was happening is that I was watching, Naumann's violin tuned. I would dub these tapes for 8 hours a day. I mean, initially in Pennsylvania, I was drawing the nude figure, and then when I moved to Chicago and started at the Video Data Bank, I started dubbing tapes, and I started working on people's archives. Worked on a Linda Benkless archive, which was totally seminal and influential. Anna Mendieta, as I said, Naumann, Paul McCarthy. I mean, that was like the real education. The other thing that happened at that time was that my boss, there were two people at the Video Data Bank. Kate Horsfield, who was the lady who founded it, one of the ladies who founded it, and then a very good friend of mine, Abina Manning. And Kate, from the get-go, late 60s, was a very militant feminist who rejected painting, anything that had a kind of male-indoctrinated gender associated to it, anything that had a kind of sequential heaviness to it, she rejected. And I think that she liked at the beginning that I was the phone guy, but after a while, she put me in the back. But she would always, she helped me out a lot, and we would sit down and we would talk an awful lot. And I feel like she didn't. I don't necessarily know. Maybe she didn't. I think she believed in me, but I also don't think that she really cared that much. So she was super honest with me, and she was very, very, very much critical of men and the art market.
Okay.
That was the start of a really good education. Yeah.
What makes me wonder what she would think of something like the Naumann.
She loved Naumann, weirdly enough. Yeah. She had met him many times. Yeah, and liked him. Yeah. Yeah.
During this time, you happened to enroll with a friend, I think, in a 2-month-long community class. It was weekend-only community class, and your friend was a major in art therapy. And it seems like you had some sort of wager going because you didn't believe that working with ceramics or clay could be a useful therapeutic or be useful therapeutically in an art therapy context. It seems though you did reasonably quickly change your mind about that, and as you began to work in clay and ceramics, it's something that's continued unabated in your output today.
Yeah, I had these two classes that I really, really liked, and these two faculty members that I really liked. They were a little older. There was this faculty member, James Zanzi, that I loved working with at the Art Institute, and he did a class called Architecture, Monuments, and Tombs. And then there was another faculty member that I got to be very good friends with. His name is Timothy O'Donnell, and he was a licensed psychiatrist, but he taught psych classes, and one of these kind of classes they taught was the psychology of death. And both of these courses dealt with art as therapy. And I met my friend who, she was like finalizing her kind of master's at the Art Institute, and then was going to go into her PhD in art therapy. And one of the things that she was learning about at that time was clay kneading exercises. And she was like, explaining this to me, and I was just like, that's bullshit. That is like, oh, that's so, sure, yeah, okay. Kneading clay, that makes sense, yeah. And, she saw that I was being extremely cynical about it, and that I thought that it was too easy, and that it wasn't conceptual enough. And she said, you know what, I think you and I should take this community course. It's not, it wasn't an art course. It was a two-month-long course. Should I go on?
Yeah, if you wish.
Anyway, she took me to this, we enrolled in this free-form building course, but it wasn't necessarily an art course, and it had a lot of different generations to it. So we had these kind of troubled teens in the class. There was a couple of, women who were, maybe in their mid to late 40s. We had this accountant guy in the class. But we had a very good instructor. She was, she was a ceramicist, and she totally believed in what my friend was kind of talking about. Anyway, the first month of the class were more, they let us do what we wanted. They would give us kind of clay, and while we were kind of building things without any sort of prerequisite, they were teaching us about glazes and cone firing temperatures, kind of logistics of how ceramics operate in terms of production, but not how to build anything. And I remember after that first month looking at everybody's projects, and it didn't matter if it was the the two troubled teens or the accountant guy or the grandmother. Everybody's work was exactly the same, and it looked the same. It was hyper anthropomorphic. It was, totally raw. It almost seemed sexual, and everybody was using the exact same glazes. I think they gave us, like 5 glazes that we could use, and of course, everybody, is pouring the same glaze over everything, and so everything looked exactly the same. As a matter of fact, I remember this great moment when they opened up the kiln. This one time after a big, long glaze firing, and like. Two people had put their works too close to one another, and they just kind of fused together with the glazes. Yeah, that's brilliant. The second month, they taught us how to build structure, and at that point, everybody's work became completely separate from one another. And I realized that there was a kind of innate scenario within the first month and a conditioned scenario within the second month. My friend was completely right, that there is something, kind of, again, it was something that was very, very much spontaneous, and it was all happening at once without a type of conditioned kind of scenario to that. But I came away with the class with, I apologized to her, I think at that point, things started to change for me. I started to feel less cynical about art. And I don't necessarily know if that to me right now seems very negative, to be cynical about art. But I know a lot of my friends are cynical about art, who are artists, who are critics, who are curators. And I remember at that time thinking that I don't want to do that. I don't want to be cynical. I wanted to be very, very, very upfront and honest and sincere about it.
Well, that's something I wanted to ask about, because between your coursework and professors here in Chicago, your broader exposure to art here, which clearly you took on at a vertiginous rate. And studio techniques and materials, ceramics just being one of them, that you were exposed to, it appears in hindsight now that your time here in Chicago was, at least up to this point, the inflection point in your career. So once you moved down to California, your mental concepts and manifestations of those concepts as artwork are the sterling ruby that we know and see today. Prior to your time in Chicago, it was decidedly student-level work. So I'm wondering, for students who might be here today or in general terms, what was it specifically about your time in Chicago that allowed you to focus and distill your mature artistic vision?
I think there are a couple of things. I mean, because I was such a, the Art Institute gave me a pretty good deal. They let me go for a year and a half and actually gave me a bachelor's, which was quite nice. But at the Art Institute, I didn't really make any work. I didn't have a studio at the Art Institute. I was an undergraduate, and as many of you know, it wasn't, you don't get studios then. I mean, maybe like a small portion, but I didn't get a studio. At the Video Data Bank, I had a really good friend, Tom Colley, who ran this place called the Butcher Shop. And it was this kind of warehouse that he rented, and of course, they didn't do it by permit or anything. It was a total fire hazard. They built out all these little rooms, and I rented a studio from him from the get-go, from the time that I started working at the Video Data Bank and became friends with this guy, Tom. So I had a studio that I could work in private, that I didn't really, I mean, at the beginning, I didn't let anybody in. I just kind of did my thing. But I had a lot of friends who were not at the Art Institute and who were all graduate students at University of Illinois, Chicago. And they were on a much higher level than I was. But I was with them all the time. I wasn't in their crits, I wasn't in their classes, I wasn't with their faculty members that they were learning from, but I heard everything, and I was actually much older than a lot of them, but I was off track, I was trying to catch up. But I saw what they were doing. They were trying to do studio visits, they were trying to have shows. It seemed much, much, much more serious than what I was doing. But I was still playing catch up. But a lot of that had a kind of had a rush to it. I felt like I needed to make up some time.
Okay.
And that charged it. Yeah.
After you did graduate from AIC in 2002, you decided to relocate to Los Angeles, where you still live, actually. And in 2003, you matriculated into the MFA program at Pasadena's Art Center College of Design. Now, you served as Mike Kelly, there he is, his teaching assistant for 2 years. And you were close with other people there, Richard Hawkins, who wrote a terrific article on Sterling and Flash Art back in 2006, if you ever get the chance to read that. During this time, though, there was very little discussion, or I should say there was very little time for the production of art. You were spending a great deal of time in the discussion of what the art would be if you were to make it. So I'm wondering if that repeated discussing and describing the work before actually creating it became an increasing source of frustration for you, who especially you really do like to, you're a hands-on person, so.
Not at first. I thought it was phenomenal. I mean, the reason why I said that thing about the Helter Skelter catalog being at that school in Pennsylvania is that it was it. Like, it just drew me to the West, I applied to 2 programs, and everybody under the sun at that point was applying to these 2 programs because in LA at that time, everybody was still teaching. So I applied to UCLA and I applied to Art Center, and I applied to UCLA because I wanted to work directly with Chris Burden, Nancy Rubens, and Paul McCarthy. And I applied to Art Center because I wanted to work with Mike Kelly and Liz Lerner and Richard Hawkins, Chris Williams. There was a gamut of actual practicing artists that were teaching. I lucked out and I got into Art Center, and right away Mike and I, we became pretty good friends. And so I became his teaching assistant, and we put together right off the bat, they put together a thesis committee for you, which is heavy. And the entire program is built around discourse and French postmodernism philosophy. And it was also at the time, it's changed that way at Art Center, but at the time they had two programs. They had an MA program and an MFA program, and it was totally collided together. So we had some amazing students that were going to be critics, writers, curators, who were at the same time and in the same building as the studio students, the MFA students. Actually, one of the people I graduated with, Michael Nedholt, was here yesterday. I haven't seen him in 6 years, and I was like, hey, crazy. But it was all discourse. I made work, but I made it outside of the school again. The other thing that the school had a lot of heavy duty philosophy people.
Yeah, I'll ask you. I know that one of the people there was Sylvain L'Étranger, who's a noted French editor, semiotext and comparative literature specialist, and he clearly had an import on you. He also brought many French postmodernist writers, which Sterling had alluded to, over to the States, and of all of them, it seems that one of them, who was a colleague of Sylvain's, but who had passed away long ago in '92, well before you ever reached Pasadena, was Felix Guattari. And Guattari is one of the things he's most well known for is a 1960s concept of transversality. So I'm wondering if you can describe your time with Sylvain, as well as this concept of transversality and what it means specifically to your work, or if it's specifically something that's wedded to your thinking.
Yeah. The first semester that I was there, they didn't really, it was such a small program. There were only 12 students in the MFA program, and I think maybe 12 students in the MA program. And not this guy, but Sylvain L'Étranger, who was one of the heads in the philosophy department at Columbia, would come in every semester and teach a class, and we kind of fly back and forth. And I remember they put me in this class of his it was an Artaud and a Virilio class, and I was just like, again, I had been really trying to play catch up in terms of theory. For 3-4 years, but theory's hard. It's particularly French postmodernist theory is kind of, and everybody at the school was smart. All of the students were very smart. All of the MA students were just like, there were fights, fist fights in crit class. Oh God, it was. So I was super nervous to go to this guy's class for the first time because I didn't feel like I was up to par. I didn't feel like I could sit in a class with the guy who brought French postmodernism to the States, and who was friends with Baudrillard and everybody. He was. Anyway, I remember the first day he separated us into artists and critics. And he said, I want the critics on this side of the room, and I want the artists on this side of the room. And we were all like, okay, yeah, cool. And he told us this really funny story about Baudrillard in the bathtub. And he said, he did this eulogy for Baudrillard when he died. And he said, I passed it by, Baudrillard's partner, his wife. And, one of the passages in it was his wife told him, Baudrillard isn't just Baudrillard when he's writing, but he's also Baudrillard when he's in the bathtub. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, I think the class, you know, I mean, of course, a lot of the class was like, yes, we know what you mean, you know, blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, I don't think you know what I mean. You're all who you are. And artists aren't theorists, and theorists aren't artists. And I want it to stay that way, which means that I don't ever want the artist side to take things literally. And he started talking specifically about, you know, Guattari and Deleuze, and he said, you know, these things are meant to be read pragmatically, and you take from them what you want, and you only use it to your own advantage. And it was super liberating to hear this from like the most seminal figure that we still have in regards to all of that.
Okay. So now...
But I forgot transversality.
Oh, yeah. Did you want to touch?
I feel like is everybody cool with it?
Yeah.
All right. So I don't really ever think that we would sit, Silvera and I would sit down and I'd be like, oh, God, I can't wrap my head around transversality. But what I think I got from it was that when something looks a certain way, particularly an environment, it's not the inhabitants that change it, but the environment that changes the inhabitants. So we would always, you know, I mean, even so early on, Silver and I would talk about prison. And we would talk about prison as an environment that you might be different prior to going in, but once you're in, it changes you. And this can be everything from a park to, you know, a room in an apartment to, you know, a flight, you know, on a plane. Transversality is when something has an aura, it will ultimately change you. You will not change the aura, but the aura will change you.
Okay. Kind of tightly, right.
Yeah, okay.
So now we do approach this milestone for you, we can call it that. And I'm going to backtrack just for a moment. So we're in 2002, 2003 in Los Angeles with Sterling at Pasadena, but now I'm going to come back a little bit, and we're in Chicago. And this is around the late 90s and the early 2000s. If you were here, you were experiencing a flowering of non-commercial galleries with names like Western Exhibitions and Open to End and 1R that were held largely in domestic spaces with a clearly something you said you enjoyed earlier, a DIY, do-it-yourself attitude. One of these Chicago spaces at the time, which is no longer extant, is the Suitable Gallery, which was actually a barely heated Humboldt Park two-car garage with an additional project space attached, which was actually the laundry room. And you had your first solo exhibition there in 2003 in February, titled The Hydroponic Connection. And this exhibition dealt with, in your words, thaw, nature, and interior hallucination.
Yeah, that sounds like...
Okay, well... You installed this lifelike, fully functioning hydroponic growing facility, which was embedded with fake U.S. government study marijuana plants in the corner of this two-car garage. What can you tell us about your first one-person exhibition? What do you want to tell us? Maybe is more telling about that.
You know, I was you know, I think Chicago at that time, we had a really tight-knit group of people who were all trying to have shows. You know, we all wanted it, and you know, everybody I knew, and some people were more lucky. Me, particularly, my time in Chicago was not so lucky. You know, everybody would go to all the galleries, and they'd be like, oh, you know, want to do a studio visit? No, absolutely not. You know, and people would take their portfolios around, and, you know, I mean, so this was our option at the time, these really small DIY spaces. You know, the experience of showing in an apartment in the, or I'm sorry, the experience of showing in a garage during the middle of a Chicago winter sucked. You know, I remember, you know, trying to do the show, and, you know, there was water involved, and the water kept freezing, you know. I don't know, but it was good at the same time. You know, I mean, I did it, you know, maybe it wasn't completely thought through. I don't think it's the best show I've ever done, but you know, everybody was there, and it started something. I mean, it started, you know, I mean, it was like the first time where you just maxed out your credit cards because you know you had to do it, no matter what.
Do you remember the prices of the work that you had for sale in that show?
Do you?
Mm-hmm.
No, I have no idea.
You had 15 silk marijuana plants for $150 each,
Yeah.
and there was a VHS video that you had in that
Oh, yeah, yeah,
project
right,
space.
right.
There it is, Cook. That was an edition of
Yeah.
10, and that was $700.
Yeah.
Things
Yeah,
have
they
changed a little
those
bit.
didn't sell at all. A couple of the pot plants sold, but I do remember I had to pay $50 for each of them. They were shipped from some other country.
Things have changed.
Yeah, a little bit.
The formal installation, if we take a look at this, but now we're standing in the garage looking at this in the corner, sort of, if you will. When I saw this, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but because I knew you were a fan of Nauman, we talked about Nauman, Learned Helplessness in Rats, Rock and Roll Drummer.
Yeah.
It reminded me, sort of rhymed formally, with this piece from '69 by Nauman, The Dream Room. Were you aware of it at the time or not?
Yes, I was aware
Oh,
of
okay,
it, 100%. I was also aware that a lot of my friends, you know, I mean, things change, you know, styles change, you know, ideas change. But I do remember a lot of my friends at UIC making extremely kind of minimal, slick work on the outside with kind of content on the inside. And I don't necessarily know if that makes sense, but there was somehow a distance between, you know, a kind of clinical sensibility, you know, and a personal sensibility. I mean, maybe those two aren't necessarily separate from one another, but you know, from the facade of it, it looked extremely slick and minimal, and from, you know, the subject matter, you know, it was heavy, it was content. Yeah.
At this same, or I should say, just following this exhibition, later in 2003 and in 2004, there were a couple of other one-person shows still here in Chicago.
Yeah.
They were heavy on collage-based work. Here's one from around that period. And in researching this, I continually fell upon the term that you were discussing of the illicit merger. And I was wondering what the illicit merger is and how it related.
I had read once this I don't know what I read, but it was this theorist's book on collage, and I remember this kind of passage that he was writing specifically about Schwitters and Picasso, and that collage, the definition of collage for him was the illicit merger of disparate things. And that meant things that didn't necessarily have anything to do with one another becoming a kind of hybridization, a fusion, which I thought was pretty seminal.
So that idea of the hybridization was the key to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're coming back into time now where we were in 2003. And after 2 intensive years at the Arts Center, you said that you, by that point, you felt a bit violated by the program's cumbersome and inhibiting process, again, of having to verbally dissect everything before you could actually potentially create the thing itself.
Yeah.
You had said, you're on record, that you were keen to, quote, do something different. I assume part of that meant maybe a little less talk and a little more making physical work. And that results in your 2005 thesis show, which was called Monument to Interiority. And the review committee was initially split on the merits of this, and they initially didn't approve it, though. I mean, you did graduate, so they must have. I don't know.
I didn't.
You didn't? Okay. Why were they split on this? And what can you share with us about this exhibition?
My committee was pretty solid, and they were very supportive, but they were all. I had Mike Kelly, Richard Hawkins, Bruce Hanley, Patty Podesta, and Dr. Lawrence Rickles. And I don't know if anybody knows Dr. Lawrence Rickles, but he's considered the vampire doctor. He's a theorist, and he writes predominantly about schizophrenia. He's also the son of Don Rickles.
Wow.
They were supportive.
That's a
Without doubt,
pedigree.
they were super supportive. You know, I mean, Mike was the most supportive and has helped me out. Well, it did help me out. But the thesis review, what you would do is all of the students were there, and then all of the faculty, including your committee. So we had the head of the department, Jeremy Gilbert-Rolfe, Chris Williams, Tim Martin, Jim Shaw. I mean, there was probably 20 faculty members. So that was always like, your 3 years at Art Center was always, based on this nervousness of going in front of the entire school and defending yourself. And because it was so debate-oriented, it was, I don't know why they did this, because I really felt like I made it out alive, but I think a lot of people did not. I think a lot of people got beat down so hard that they stopped. They didn't want to do it. Anyway, it came down to you have to do two things. You have to write a 40-plus page thesis paper, and you have to do a seminal exhibition. And I did do both. I think my exhibition was probably better than my thesis, but I think my thesis committee was so, they all had different intentions for me and different requests from me in regard to, what their ideas were and how I was going to fit in. Later on, I realized they all wanted me to be them, which I think is probably a pretty typical thing on most thesis committees. Anyway, it was like 2 hours of fighting and yelling and screaming. Mike quit. Mike quit a couple of months after that. I don't, this is not why he quit, but part of it. And I never got a degree. I paid for it. I went, I put the time in, but they never gave me I could probably fight it if I wanted to. But, there was something about that hurt, but it also made a lot of sense. And I've been remembering that and kind of putting it to work ever since graduating. I think it was actually a really good experience for me.
Okay. I'm going to cut ahead. There were more collages at this time that dealt with what you had already spoken about, the hybridization idea and the illicit merger, in this case with the post-pre-op transgender individuals and the nail polish. But soon after these series of collages, we begin to see these sort of hulking epic monoliths that draw formally on another era of this masculine orthodox art language, minimalism, clearly here. And you are consciously referencing artists, such as a favorite of mine, Ronnie Bladen,
Yeah.
Bob Morris, Tony Smith. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about this body of work.
Yeah. It's funny because those three artists are really, I love those three artists. What was happening at Art Center the last year that I was there is that there were a ton of minimalist exhibitions, big survey shows that were happening, both at LA MoCA and at LACMA. One of the people that I would meet with on a weekly basis was the curator, Ann Goldstein. And all of the sculpture classes that year were geared towards minimalism. And so we had to read Judd, nonstop. We read Judd. And I started to hate Judd a lot, because I felt like not only were there, you know, rules, regulations, and power built into, you know, his kind of thesis of what minimalism was, but there were, you know, I mean, there was such a kind of overarching gender and systematic refusal to it being anything other than that. You know, I've always been a fan of Tony Smith, because he's you know, I know Kiki, and we've talked about her father a good bit. But his was based on a spirituality within geometry and what it meant to kind of look at something. And of course, you know, Michael Fried would write about minimalism in response to wanting to make something that looked as if it was never made, you know? And I didn't necessarily like that. I thought things have changed over time, and I started thinking a lot about, you know, some of the conversations that Silver and I would have about prisons and architecture and things that happened inside architecture. And that boxes, although on the outside might not seem as if anything was living inside of it, a lot of times the kind of quagmire, the personality of a box was what was interior. And so I started a series of works that were basically defaced monuments. And these works have kind of continued today, but most of them are outdoor works. I think I've changed my mind about, I mean, I like this series that I did, but recently what we've been doing is we make these boxes, these kind of grids out of stainless steel. We usually powder coat them to be some kind of institutional color, and then we stick them somewhere. I don't know if you have any images of those. Oh, this
I
is
do.
kind of, but I really like now these kind of boxes, these geometric works that are very simple, very monochromatic, and we put them out somewhere in the public so that they're unprotected. And I really like this idea of public artwork being unprotected, that you get this kind of case study where you see the reaction almost as a participation, you know, and you get a lot of defacement, a lot of abuse on these sculptures, and so they have this kind of life of their own. Even though they're initially minimal, there's like an attacking going on that you know, is kind of uncontrollable.
As this work progressed, and speaking of your work with Silver and prisons, these monolithic structures grow into more looming and foreboding forms, and they start to reference repressive architecture, such as maximum security prisons, the so-called supermax prison that's been actually in the news quite a bit lately. These rather muscular, ultra-ambitious and overscale sculptures were featured in your 2010 Chelsea exhibition, Two Traps. And the two works that were featured were Bus there in the foreground on the right, and Pigpen in the background and on the left.
Yeah.
Now, I recall the lunch that we had together pretty almost immediately after the opening.
Yeah.
And it was quite apparent from people's reactions already that they were polarized about the show. It didn't seem to bother you or upset you, but you were curious about the reaction. And so I'm wondering what you can share with us about this exhibition.
Yeah. I had, you know, I was asked to do a show in the old Dia space in New York, and I mean, I was also asked to do I was asked to do a show that was that could sell. I wasn't asked that. You know, nobody's going to ask that in one way. But they might ask it in another way, like, how about if we do a painting show? I said, no, I'm not doing a painting show. I want to do these two sculptures. I want them to sit there like these two rectangular blocks. And, you know, this is going to be like the final, you know, realization of the Supermax series. And prior to that, I had done a bunch of shows titled Supermax that had at the heart of them this notion that my generation, as this kind of almost allegorical situation, was not being corrected, only detained, which is what like a Supermax penitentiary does. You know, they don't rehabilitate; they only detain. And so the bus I'm not sure if this is true or not, but we bought it from a company. It was a totally beat up bus. And the company told us that it had a number of different lives. And we were told that it was initially used for LA County for the transportation of prisoners back and forth. But it was it just looked like a city bus, you know. And when it was kind of pushed out of that use, it was then bought by this party company. And they outfitted it completely with leather seating and bars. And what they would do is they would bar hop. You know, you could rent the bus and the bus driver to do bachelor parties and bachelorette parties. And they would just, drive you through town and get you loaded, and you could do whatever you wanted on the bus. And and then it was bought by this speaker manufacturer, this subwoofer company, and their intention was to outfit it as one of the world's biggest mobile sound systems, and they would take it to contests, for like, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this, but they do subwoofer contests, who could get the biggest decibel. And what their intention was to use it as a selling tool for their subwoofers. But they went bankrupt, and so they were selling this bus, and the guy who sold it to us had this like long, crazy story about it. And I said, "This is the bus. This is the bus we want. This is like Tupac's, California bus that drives out into the desert." It's like, and so we went to look at it, and the guy was like, "I'll sell it to you." And it wasn't that expensive either. It was actually very cheap. But we got all of his speakers with it as well.
While researching this sculpture, just recently, I came to find out that at the time you were interested in or a subscriber to a whole subculture of bus conversion magazine. And I was like, who knew? I mean, evidently there are people who are really into their buses.
Super into it. So my team and I'm just talking about the bus. Maybe I don't. We're probably taking way too long. I'm like running.
We are. We'll
but anyway,
end soon.
If anybody,
so don't worry.
You just walk in.
Yeah.
So my team and I got obsessed with buses. We were looking at buses all the time. We were driving everywhere throughout LA, looking at buses and checking out city buses. I'm like, wow, that's a great bus. And so we I have a couple of guys in the studio that do research for me, and they were like, listen, there is a subculture, and I think we really have to take part of this. And so we started reading Bus Conversion magazine and just like obsessing over these people who were using these like city buses as touring kind of conversion buses. And so we learned a lot of how to retrofit our bus, in order to ship it to New York to show it. The bus itself, in my opinion, was a time machine. And I started thinking specifically about it's maybe, I don't know if it's fictitious or not, maybe the guy was just telling us what he thought we wanted to hear. But I started thinking about the notion of this bus transporting people from their public lives to, from their private lives to a very public institution, which was, and time. The manifestation of crossing that border in this bus and what your time would be like on both ends. And maybe it's a liberating scenario when you're, not in prison. Maybe it's even a more liberating scenario when you are in prison. But either way, there's a shuttling of time. And I started thinking specifically of these two sculptures. And I had been thinking a lot about time machines as well, abstractly. But these two works for me were very much about time. It's also, this idea of transversality. My parents, they had this big van when I was younger, and they would just, we would just take off. And so there was always this kind of, nomadic scenario to a vehicle like that. And so we got obsessive. When this bus came to the studio, we were like, we took so many pictures of it. getting unloaded off of that. We were really excited, like coming home.
Now, there was another sculpture, which was Pigpen as well.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's pretty easy, I mean, to make the trope or the rhyme. To look at this, you're talking about minimalism earlier and troping on that, and certainly something like LeWitt looms large.
Yeah.
And you've been on record about, you've already discussed to a certain extent your concerns, let's put it that way, about minimalism. So I assume that this is part of that ongoing investigation and reaction to or for or against minimalism.
Yeah,
largely.
I mean, without a doubt. And I think maybe it's a long conversation. It's maybe a little boring. The bus, Pigpen, the cage structure, was made using the dimensions of Pelican Bay's detaining cells. Pelican Bay is one of the most ferocious. You have an image of Pelican Bay?
No, but I'm going back to that.
Okay.
Pigpen for it.
Pelican Bay is the most notorious supermax penitentiary in upstate New York, or upstate California.
Right.
And each cell, we learned to weld at the same time that we were reading Bus Conversion magazine. We bought a lot of equipment, and we started manufacturing these cells, these detaining cells. So, at Pelican Bay, if you have a cell extraction out of your main cell, they'll put you into one of these little boxes for a period of time until you get transferred. And so my idea, again, was this kind of like make this almost, LeWitt type cellular structure that would some of them were flat, some of them were upright, some of them were upside down. So when you would look at it, you would have this kind of transparency, but also this depth of cage. And I think that there were 88 in the entire piece. I think that there's 88 cages.
Okay.
I think. Something like that.
I'm going to end today because we're really already at our time, so we barely got the chance to scratch.
Yeah.
But to round off this part of the discussion with Pigpen and Bus and the aspects of minimalism, you made some, I believe they were posters, and in an exhibition catalog from Bergamo, this is an interior of the bus. Is this work, and the catalog seems to state or infer that you refer to minimalism or invoke minimalism, whatever the right term would be, as a means to expose underlying systems and social power structures. And I'm wondering if minimalism and architecture are linked in your mind, and if so, how and why?
I don't necessarily, sure, I think that they're probably linked to some degree. I mean, most of the students when I was in grad school were like heavily obsessed with architecture. I think for me it's not so much, I mean, I've lobbed onto things in order to kind of expose that kind of scenario, but I think for me it's more about anything definitively within art history or within social history that has at its heart or at its kind of main viewpoint a kind of regulation system or a kind of power system doesn't, I mean, maybe it seems obvious that that's not liberating, but I think looking at art history particularly, there's this kind of detrimental synopsis that happens as time goes by. And I think a lot of artists my age are put to task by referring to the baggage of that. And I think a lot of times that equals a certain trope or almost a death. And I think for me, I like this idea that art is therapy, but I think more than anything, as an artist working today, I would like to assume that my work has an aura that can't necessarily be defined. And that's maybe why I'm like a schizophrenic and I jump around so much. And I just think that's the way it is now. There's too much, it's baggage. Yeah.
You were talking about this a bit last night, and as I dropped you at the hotel and then went home, I was remembering, I recalled a discussion I'd had with Bob Rauschenberg.
Yeah.
And he had once said in his usual very generous way that he wanted to create a situation where there was as much room for the viewer as the artist. It was something that, a theme that he would come back to. And so I just wanted to thank you for making room for us today in your practice, and for you know, for sharing your vision with us today.
Thanks, Todd.
Terrific. Thank you very much.